Imagine walking up to this grand ancient library.
Oh, setting the scene. I like it.
Yeah, so just picture it. The architecture is breathtaking, the columns have stood for thousands of years, and inside are, the most profound secrets of human history, philosophy, art, basically the accumulated wisdom of Western civilization.
Right, the classics.
Exactly, but as you get closer, you smell smoke, because the building is actually on fire.
Okay, that took a turn.
It gets worse because when you burst through the heavy oak doors to save the books, you find the caretakers, the very people who are hired and paid pretty handsomely, I might add, to protect the library, and they're just standing around the flames.
Not throwing water on it, I'm guessing?
Not at all. They aren't throwing water on the fire. They are arguing over who had the most traumatic childhood, and they're tossing the books into the flames to keep themselves warm.
Man, it's a profoundly unsettling image, honestly.
Yeah.
You walk in expecting the guardians of the tradition to be the ones sounding the alarm, and instead you find out they're the ones holding the matchbook.
Yeah, and welcome to today's deep dive, because we are taking you right into the heart of a blazing controversy in higher education today.
A really massive one.
Right. Our source material today is a stack of excerpts from a highly provocative, just incredibly fiery book called Bonfire of the Humanities. Specifically, rescuing the classics in an impoverished age.
Which is such a great title.
It really is. It's written by Victor Davis Hanson, John Heath, and Bruce S. Thornton, and published by ISI Books. And their central argument, the whole mission of this deep dive, is to explore their claim that the traditional humanities and classical studies of ancient Greece and Rome in particular are dying.
And this is the key part. They aren't being killed by outside forces.
Right. Not video games.
Not shrinking university budgets or, a lack of public interest. The call is coming from inside the house. The authors claim the humanities are being dismantled by the professors themselves.
Exactly. We're going to unpack their critique of modern academia's shift toward multiculturalism, postmodernism, and this idea of personal voice scholarship.
But.
We really need to pause right here. We need to weave a very clear perimeter around our discussion today.
We do. Because before we get into the mechanics of how they believe this dismantling is happening, we need to explicitly state to you listening that the source material we are working with contains highly politically charged content.
Highly charged.
Right. These authors are writing from a self-described traditionalist and populist perspective. They are aiming a relentless, unsparing critique at the left-wing, multicultural, and postmodern ideologies that currently dominate modern academia.
Yeah, they are tearing down some of the most sacred cows of the modern university system.
So, just to be crystal clear, we aren't here to pick a winner.
At all. We aren't taking sides, we aren't endorsing this critique, nor are we defending the academics under fire.
Right. Our goal is purely to impartially map out and convey the fascinating ideas and arguments contained in this original text.
We're just putting on our fireproof suits and walking you through the blast radius of this book. We want to map out the architecture of this intellectual battlefield so you can understand the explosive ideas these guys are putting forward.
Perfectly said. We are dissecting the anatomy of their argument.
Yeah.
That argument begins with a fundamental diagnosis. The study of classical antiquity in America is moribund.
It's basically on life support.
Exactly. Now, the authors do acknowledge that America's general drift toward crass materialism and utilitarianism plays a role in this decline. Like, they get that society is changing.
Right, everyone wants an app developer degree now.
Yeah, but they place the lion's share of the blame squarely on the culture of the American campus itself. They argue that professors have completely abandoned their primary duty.
Which is teaching undergraduates.
Teaching undergraduates. In favor of churning out esoteric, jargon-filled careerist publications that almost no one on Earth actually reads.
Okay, let's look at the framework they use to attack this problem, because they introduce their stance as academic populism.
Which is a really interesting phrase.
Right, because when I hear the word populism, my mind immediately goes to politics. The working class laborer pushing back against a wealthy, out-of-touch elite. How are they adapting a political concept into a critique of university classics departments?
So they actually trace the roots of American populism back to the 19th century to explain their stance. They point out that historic American populism wasn't some utopian, abstract socialist scheme.
Right, it wasn't about completely overthrowing society.
Or redistributing all wealth, exactly. It was actually a highly pragmatic, concrete movement. It was farmers and railroad workers demanding a fair return for a good product.
They were just pushing back against an unimaginative corporate oligarchy that was basically squeezing them dry.
Yeah. And the authors adopt this exact pragmatic framework for the academic world.
So it's about the literal nuts and bolts of the job. It's not about overthrowing the dean. It's about how the university functions as a workplace.
It is entirely about the daily reality of the institution. Academic populism, for them, means demanding fair compensation for the adjunct professors. Because the adjuncts are the ones who do the heavy lifting of teaching.
Oh, absolutely.
It means demanding reasonable, robust teaching loads for tenured professors rather than letting them hide in their offices. It demands clear, accessible writing that the public, who, funds these universities, can actually understand.
Right, pushing back against this explosion of hyper-specialized academic publication, because that exists for one single reason.
To advance a professor's career up the tenure ladder.
Exactly, rather than to actually advance human knowledge or engage with the public. And we really need to pause and explain the mechanics of that.
The tenure pipeline?
Yeah, because if you aren't in academia, the phrase publish or perish sounds like a cliche, but it's actually the entire economic engine of the university. You spend 7 years grinding for tenure, and to get it, you have to publish a massive volume of peer-reviewed papers. But, and this is the catch, there are only so many new things to say about ancient Greek pottery.
Literally only so many pots.
Yeah. So to keep publishing, you have to invent increasingly convoluted niche theories just to get past the review board, just to secure your job and keep your health insurance.
And that systemic pressure breeds the profound hypocrisy the authors point out. They paint a vivid picture of tenured professors who spend their entire careers writing these dense papers railing against the evils of capitalism.
Oh, the irony.
Railing against classism and the oppression of Western culture. Yet these very same professors live incredibly privileged, comfortable lives.
Like historically comfortable.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They have lifetime job security through tenure, which is something almost no one in the private sector has. They live in secure suburban homes, they travel the world for international conferences, they take 3 months off every summer.
And they might actually only teach undergraduates for like 10 hours a week.
If that.
It feels a bit like, okay, think of a high-end restaurant where the head chef is pulling down a massive salary.
A Michelin star place, maybe?
Yeah, a Michelin star chef who spends all their time writing these highly theoretical cookbooks full of abstract flavor theories, things that no actual person can cook.
Right. And simultaneously lecturing the diners about how exclusionary and elitist fine dining is.
Exactly. And then complaining that the general public just doesn't appreciate culinary art, all while completely refusing to ever work the line at a normal diner to feed regular people.
That is a spot-on analogy. The authors are basically saying, look, you can't be a revolutionary upper-class critic of American inequity from a faculty lounge in Palo Alto.
You just can't.
If you really want to dismantle the system, take a sabbatical in Bakersfield or Compton and implement your calls for social change.
Yeah, because they are exhausted by the spectacle of reading about the unfairness of American life from people who are among the most comfortable, insulated, and heavily subsidized individuals in the country.
Entirely thanks to the very system of democratic capitalism they're attacking.
Right. And they argue that students aren't stupid. Students sense this hypocrisy. They sit in a lecture hall and watch a professor berate them about race, gender, and class, while knowing that professor lives a life completely isolated from the underprivileged people they claim to champion.
But hold on, let me play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
If you have tenure, right, a comfortable salary, and lifetime job security, doesn't that give you the exact financial freedom and protection you need to safely criticize an oppressive system?
Oh, the ivory tower defense.
Yeah, isn't that the whole point of the ivory tower? You need people insulated from the daily grind so they can analyze the systems of power and help us dismantle the bad ones. Doesn't that critical lens have immense value?
The authors actually anticipate that defense, and their answer is rooted in the very subject these professors are hired to teach, the ancient Greeks.
How so?
Well, the authors argued that true Greek philosophy, which is the bedrock of this entire discipline, was inherently populist, egalitarian, and deeply engaged with the real world.
It wasn't just abstract theory.
No, it was focused on the middle class. The yeoman farmer, the ottergoi, the people actually out there plowing the fields.
Right, the Greeks didn't invent philosophy so they could sit in a gated community and complain.
Far from it. The authors point out that foundational figures like Aeschylus, Socrates, and the historian Thucydides, they were men of action. Their lives were inextricably entwined with their fellow citizens.
Right, they fought in wars.
Brutal hand-to-hand combat. They participated in the rowdy democratic assembly. They plunged into the chaotic melee of public life. I mean, Socrates didn't hide in a faculty lounge.
He was out in the streets.
He went down to the marketplace, the agora, and aggressively questioned regular people. And the authors contrast this vibrant, physically engaged Greek tradition with today's detached academics.
Academics who actually boast about how obscure their research is.
Yeah. Who whine when a dean asks them to teach an intro-level class.
Yeah.
And who view engaging with the general public as this tacky pose that's beneath their dignity.
So to save the classics, you basically have to actually act like the classical Greeks. You have to be in the mix.
You have to be in the arena. Now, the authors do acknowledge the classical world had horrific flaws. We have to state that.
Oh, sure.
They explicitly mention the brutal exploitation of slave labor and the systemic exclusion of women in ancient Greece. But they argue that the discovery of freedom, rational debate, and middle-class empowerment was a uniquely Greek invention in the ancient Mediterranean.
So to teach it effectively, the modern classicist must embody that populist egalitarian ethos.
Exactly. So if that old school, boots on the ground, academic populism is gone, we have to look at what replaced it. What is the operating system running in the modern humanities classroom today?
Which brings us to the author's fierce critique of the current dominant ideology: multiculturalism.
Right. And this is where authors Bruce Thornton and John Heath take direct, sustained aim at the arguments of a very prominent philosopher named Martha Nussbaum. Specifically, they're looking at her book, Cultivating Humanity.
So what's her main premise?
Nussbaum's premise is that modern multiculturalism, diversity training, and identity politics in the university are actually the logical modern extensions of Socratic self-examination and liberal Enlightenment tolerance.
Oh, wow. So she's making the case that when a university mandates a multicultural curriculum today, they're doing exactly what Socrates would have wanted.
Yes, questioning the dominant culture, breaking down established norms, and looking at the perspective of the other.
Okay, I can guess that Thornton and Heath fundamentally disagree with her premise.
Oh, they tear it apart. They argue that multiculturalism, as it is actually practiced and enforced in the modern university, is not an extension of the Enlightenment. They argue it is profoundly anti-Enlightenment and anti-liberal.
We need to unpack those terms because they get thrown around a lot. What does Nussbaum mean by multiculturalism, and why do the authors think her version of it is so dangerous?
Let's look at a specific anecdote Nussbaum uses in her own book to prove her point. She tells the story of a young business graduate named Anna. So Anna gets sent by her corporate firm to work in their newly opened office in Beijing, China.
Right, the Anna in China story. So Nussbaum uses this to prove why a traditional classical education isn't enough anymore. She argues that for Anna to succeed in negotiating business in China, she didn't just need basic business acumen.
Right.
She needed to deeply understand Chinese attitudes toward work, Chinese gender relations, the lingering impact of the Cultural Revolution. And interestingly, Nussbaum argues Anna probably needed to have taken academic women's studies courses back in the United States so she could properly understand the women's studies movement currently happening in Chinese universities.
Which is a very specific requirement for a business trip.
Yeah. So Nussbaum concludes Anna required a deeply multicultural university education to prepare her for this complex, globalized world.
But the authors of our source text look at this exact same story and draw the complete opposite conclusion.
Of course they do.
They point out the utter absurdity of expecting a 4-year college curriculum to magically prepare a 22-year-old for every specific cultural nuance, historical trauma, and gender dynamic of a massive foreign nation.
I mean, that's impossible.
Right. They argue that Anna didn't need highly politicized women's studies courses or specialized diversity training. What Anna actually needed was traditional critical thinking skills, high intelligence, a baseline desire to succeed, and the intellectual adaptability that comes from a rigorous traditional liberal arts training.
The authors argue Nussbaum is conflating two entirely different concepts here. It's one thing to say global business people need to understand the basic customs of the foreign countries they trade with.
Yeah, that's not multiculturalism. That's just basic pragmatism.
That is as old as the Romans saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do.
Yeah.
But modern multiculturalism, the authors argue, isn't about teaching authentic foreign cultures or practical adaptability. It is a vehicle for anti-liberal identity politics.
Now, how are they defining anti-liberal identity politics in this context? Because liberal can mean a lot of things.
Right, so they draw on classical liberal philosophy. Think of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke or Kant. Classical liberalism posits that societies should be based on autonomous, rational individuals who possess universal, non-negotiable human rights.
And those rights belong to you regardless of the accidental circumstances of your birth, like your race, your gender, or your ethnicity. You are an individual first.
Exactly. Multiculturalism, the authors argue, flips this entirely. It asserts that your race or your culture is the primary basis for how you understand the world and how society should treat you. It traps people in group determinism rather than treating them as free-thinking individuals.
And the authors point out a massive historical irony here. The multiculturalists constantly criticize Western culture for being oppressive, imperialistic, and exclusionary. But the authors argue that the very concepts of freedom, critical consciousness, religious tolerance, and universal human rights.
The exact conceptual tools the multiculturalists are using to criticize the West.
Yes, those tools were actually invented by the West. Specifically, they were forged in the intellectual fires of Athens and Jerusalem.
Okay, I can hear someone listening to this raising their hand in the back of the room right now.
Uh-oh. What's the question?
Because Nussbaum explicitly claims that Socratic questioning is what's happening in these modern diversity classrooms. If Socrates made his name by annoying the elites of Athens, questioning the dominant culture, and looking at different perspectives, how can the authors say modern multiculturalism isn't Socratic?
That is the core of John Heath's critique, and it requires us to really look at how Socrates operated. Heath argues Nussbaum has created a false, sanitized Socratic analogy.
How so?
Well, for Socrates, questioning was never just a therapeutic exercise. It wasn't about achieving a non-judgmental mutual understanding where every culture's truth is equally valid and everyone just feels heard.
So Socrates wasn't running a modern HR seminar.
Definitely not. Socratic questioning was a rigorous, relentless, and often brutal pursuit of an ultimate, universal, objective truth. And more importantly, it demanded decisive moral action based on that truth once you found it.
Right. The Greeks believed deeply in the link between word and deed.
Exactly. If logical argument revealed that a cultural practice was morally wrong, Socrates expected you to reject it, even if it meant defying your own government or drinking hemlock.
And Heath argues that modern multiculturalism teaches a cultural relativism that Socrates would have absolutely despised. The idea that we cannot judge another culture's practices because all values are just relative to their specific time and place.
To illustrate just how dangerous this cultural relativism becomes when applied in a real classroom, the text shares a genuinely shocking anecdote.
It's referred to as the clitorectomy paper.
Yeah. So, Nussbaum, in her book, attempts to show how non-judgmental Socratic argument works in practice by citing a class taught by a professor she deeply admires. In this class, a student who they refer to as Student Q wrote a term paper defending the practice of female circumcision, or clitorectomies, as practiced in certain African cultures.
Defending it.
Yes. The student used a textbook multicultural, cultural relativist defense. He argued that because the practice is so foreign to Western conceptions of social identity and bodily autonomy, Westerners must take a neutral position. We cannot judge it. We must accept the culture's choices with, quote, graciousness.
The student is literally defending a recognized human rights abuse. The mutilation of young girls using the logic of the class.
Right.
How does the professor react? Does she fail the paper? Does she explain the limits of cultural relativism when human rights are violated?
According to the anecdote, the professor actually commended the student's strategy.
Wait, she commended the paper?
She did. She praised his insistence that internal cultural critique is somehow better or more valid than Western judgment from a distance.
So she was trapped by her own framework. She couldn't condemn it without violating the rules of multicultural relativism she was teaching. What do the authors of our source text make of this moment?
They view it as the ultimate, horrifying indictment of Nussbaum's Socratic illusion. They argue this proves that when multiculturalism forces students to abandon universal moral standards, it leads to a complete paralysis of judgment.
Heath points out the devastating logical failure here, too. If the Socratic, reason-dominated approach that Nussbaum advocates is indeed a Western invention, why is she commending a student for subordinating that rational tradition to a cultural practice that cannot be logically or morally defended?
Exactly. The authors argue that true Socratic reasoning would require condemning the practice based on universal human rights, not graciously accepting it out of a misguided respect for difference.
The authors are painting a picture of a humanities curriculum that has completely abandoned the pursuit of objective truth in favor of a therapeutic relativism, where students are taught they lack the moral standing to judge anything.
Yeah, and if this highly theoretical, relativistic curriculum is the new standard, we have to look at the real-world outcome. Are students actually buying into this pedagogical shift?
Let's look at the enrollment data.
So the authors shift from philosophical critique to hard empirical data, and the numbers are grim. They note that over the past 30 years, the percentage of bachelor's degrees awarded in the humanities dropped from 20.7% to 12.7%.
That is a massive hemorrhage. You are losing almost half your market share.
And the authors argue this is not a coincidence, nor is it just about the economy. They claim that students are voting with their feet.
Makes sense. When a student is looking at going $50,000 or $100,000 into debt for a degree, they are actively rejecting the race, gender, class, grievance scholarship that dominates the new humanities.
They recognize the difference between genuine, expansive education and narrow ideological indoctrination. And they are choosing to major in fields that offer rigorous, objective skills, or at least practical vocational training that will help them pay off that debt.
The text contrasts two very different educational approaches to prove what actually works. Think about your own college experience for a second. Think about the last time you read Shakespeare or Aristotle. Did it feel like a chore for a grade, or did it feel like a tool to understand your own life?
Because the first approach the authors highlight is the Clementine course in New York City, where the classics were used as a literal lifeline.
The Clementine course was a fascinating experiment. Traditional canonical texts, the great books of literature, political philosophy, art, logic, were taught to a group of homeless, underprivileged, and marginalized individuals.
We're talking about people dealing with severe poverty, addiction recovery, and the prison system.
Right, and the creator of the program didn't water down the curriculum. He told them, rich people learn the humanities. You didn't. The humanities are a foundation for getting along in the world, for thinking.
I love that. He treated them as intellectually capable of grappling with the hardest texts in human history. He didn't give them a pop culture studies class.
And the results speak for themselves. A year after graduation, the vast majority of these students were attending four-year colleges or nursing schools, with several receiving full scholarships to elite places like Bard College.
The authors use this to prove that traditional Western classics are universally empowering. They aren't tools of white male oppression. They are the exact cognitive tools needed to navigate, critique, and succeed in a complex world, regardless of your background.
Now compare that massive success with what the authors highlight as the grim future of the new academic model. They point to the curriculum established at a relatively new state university, Cal State Monterey Bay, as the epitome of the post-humanist takeover.
What does a post-humanist curriculum look like in practice? Let's get specific.
Instead of traditional core requirements where you read the foundational texts of history, students face mandated equity and culture requirements, where the primary objective is to analyze struggles for power and oppression. The traditional literature requirement is conflated with teledramatic arts and popular culture.
So the authors point out that Shakespeare wasn't even in the required curriculum. A visitor to the campus bookstore found no literature at all by British or European authors.
Wow.
Yeah. Instead, a student could fulfill their literature requirement by writing a paper interpreting issues of race, gender, class, or sexuality in forms of popular culture. You could write a paper on a soap opera instead of studying Hamlet.
The authors argue this is intellectual vacuity. They claim the curriculum has been stripped of the profound, complex, difficult works that actually challenge students to grow, and replaced by courses that merely reinforce contemporary political dogmas and validate the media the students are already consuming.
And they argue this intellectual vacuity isn't an accident. It starts at the very top, with the leading theorists in the field setting the tone.
They specifically target famous Marxist literary scholars, like Frederick Jameson and Stanley Fish.
For context, Marxist literary critique essentially views all texts, all history, and all human interactions through the lens of power dynamics and class struggle. Who has the power and who is being oppressed.
Right, and the authors note the staggering hypocrisy of this elite class of scholars. You have Frederick Jameson attempting to theoretically defend Stalinism, or Stanley Fish fiercely denouncing American capitalism as an oppressive force, while simultaneously holding a highly lucrative, endowed chair at a university entirely funded by the corporate wealth he claims to despise.
The authors argue these leading scholars have adopted an adolescent sophistry. They reduce the infinite complexity of human history, love, war, and tragedy into a simplistic binary struggle for power between oppressors and the oppressed.
And why do they do this? Why reduce everything to power dynamics? The authors believe it's because of what they call the industry of avowal.
What does that mean?
Well, in the hard sciences, physics, biology,
Yeah.
you can make genuinely new factual discoveries. You can map a new gene, discover a new exoplanet, synthesize a new chemical compound. But in classical literary history, much of the foundational factual work has largely been done.
We know what the texts say. We have established the historical timelines.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like a snake eating its own tail. You've run out of ancient manuscripts to dig up in the desert, but the tenure machine still demands you publish a book every few years.
That is exactly the dynamic the authors describe.
Yeah.
To maintain the industry, to secure tenure, win massive grants, and publish the sheer volume of material required for academic promotion, scholars must invent new arcane theories.
They have to manufacture a crisis to solve.
Right. So they turn to deconstructionism, postmodern sexuality, and endless microanalyses of marginalia. Not because these theories inherently advance human understanding of the ancient world, but because the careerist engine of the university demands constant, novel publication to keep the money flowing.
And this desperate need to publish boundary-pushing novel material, when you've already deconstructed the text and you've deconstructed the history, well, it leaves you with only one thing left to write about.
Yourself.
Which brings us to an academic trend that Victor Davis Hanson critiques with a mix of scathing anger and sheer bewilderment: the ego epidemic and the personal voice in scholarship.
Yeah, Hanson focuses his fire on a book called Compromising Traditions. This book champions the personal voice in classical scholarship. The editors of this book argue that instead of writing in a detached, objective, academic voice about history, modern classicists should write deeply personal, autobiographical, confessional essays that blend their analysis of the ancient world with their own modern lives, traumas, and grievances.
So instead of writing a rigorous paper explaining the complex metrics of Roman poetry, you write a paper about how the metrics of Roman poetry make you feel about your own recent midlife crisis.
That is precisely what is happening. And the authors of our source text view this as the absolute nadir of the humanities. To highlight how far the standards have fallen, Hanson contrasts this modern trend with the ancient historian Thucydides.
Thucydides is an interesting counterexample because he actually did use the first person in his historical writing.
He did.
Like when he wrote about the horrific plague that devastated Athens, he didn't just write the plague happened, he wrote, I had the plague.
Yes, but Hanson emphasizes how and why Thucydides used the personal voice. He used it sparingly and with immense clinical gravitas. He mentions that he survived the Athenian plague or that he suffered 20 years of political exile. But he only includes these deeply traumatic personal details to lend crucial empirical expertise to his narrative.
He doesn't spend pages complaining about the unfairness of his exile.
No, he doesn't center his emotional scars. He uses his harrowing personal experience to document the symptoms of the plague accurately, so future generations could recognize it. His ego is entirely subordinate to the history.
Now, contrast that classical dignity with the modern examples Hanson pulls from compromising traditions. It is wild to realize these are published in academic journals.
They really are.
He quotes professors writing at length about their drunken parents, their midlife crises, their failed marriages, their body image, and their sexual encounters.
It's so inappropriate.
One author boasts about introducing four-letter words into translations of classical texts just for shock value. Another spends pages complaining about mean-spirited British classicists who corrected her Latin pronunciation or denied her tenure decades ago.
And Hanson highlights a thick layer of philosophical irony here. These academics rely heavily on French postmodern theory. Think of philosophers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida.
Right.
Deconstructionism, at a very basic level, argues that language doesn't reflect objective reality. It just reflects power structures. It famously claims the author is dead, meaning there is no essential, stable self behind a text, and that all identity is just a social construct built by power dynamics.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Yet, these very same academics use these theories that deny the existence of the self to justify endlessly, obsessively writing about their own essential selves.
It's a complete contradiction. You're using a theory that says, I don't exist as an individual, to justify writing 50 pages about your personal feelings of scholarly inadequacy.
Exactly.
And Hanson points out another glaring contradiction in their victimhood narrative, doesn't he? They constantly attack the white, middle-class, heterosexual male as this oppressive bogeyman ruining academia.
Yes. Hanson notes that they hurl this accusation constantly, framing themselves as marginalized rebels. They completely ignore the objective reality that they themselves, these tenured professors at elite institutions, are some of the most privileged, highly compensated, securely employed elites in human history.
They are complaining about marginalization while sitting squarely in the center of the cultural and educational power structure, attending international conferences and enjoying summers off while making six-figure salaries.
It's unbelievable.
But let me ask a genuine question about the intent here. Isn't there some value in tearing down the cold, detached, ivory tower academic voice? Doesn't making the scholar vulnerable, showing that they are a real person with flaws and biases, make the history more accessible and relatable to a 19-year-old college student who might find an ancient text intimidating?
It's a fair point, and Hansen actually validates the intent behind wanting to make history more accessible. But he completely rejects this execution. He clarifies that the result of this personal voice movement isn't accessible history. It's narcissistic bathos.
Bathos being that literary term for an absurd, sudden transition from the elevated and profound to the incredibly trivial and silly.
Exactly. Hansen argues that forcing an undergraduate to read about a wealthy professor's anger at a journal editor or their angst over a bad breakup does absolutely nothing to help that student understand the tragedy of the Peloponnesian War or the complex philosophy of Plato.
It doesn't illuminate the ancient text, it obscures it.
It simply centers the massive ego of the modern academic over the majesty and profound otherness of the ancient world. The ancient Greeks are relegated to being mere props in the professor's publicly funded personal therapy session.
And this intense focus on the personal ego, combined with these fierce, inward-looking ideological battles, eventually spilled over from the pages of obscure academic journals into real-world paranoia.
Oh, this part.
Which brings us to the bizarre conclusion of our deep dive. When I say bizarre, I mean genuinely jaw-dropping. We have to talk about the Unabomber and the FBI.
This is the astonishing real-world fallout from Victor Davis Hanson's critique of the personal voice movement. As we just discussed, Hanson wrote a scathing public review of the book Compromising Traditions, which was co-edited by a classicist named Judith Hallett.
So Hanson writes this review basically saying her book is narcissistic, unscholarly, and representative of everything wrong with the humanities. How does Professor Hallett respond? Does she write a rigorous academic rebuttal defending her methodology? Does she debate him?
No, she took a completely different, surreal approach. Professor Hallett publicly confessed on a global academic internet listserv that she had voluntarily called the FBI to report Victor Davis Hanson and his co-author John Heath as potential suspects in the Unabomber terrorist case.
We really need to set the scene for this.
Yeah.
Because if you weren't around in 1994, the Unabomber was a massive, terrifying domestic terror threat.
Oh, absolutely terrifying.
This was a serial bomber mailing lethal explosives to universities and airlines. The entire country was on edge. And she called the FBI to say that two classical historians who wrote a book criticizing her academic theories might be the Unabomber.
That is exactly what she claimed she did on this public forum. She stated she likened their traditionalist views to the anti-technology views of a deranged serial killer.
It's like a homeowners association dispute over lawn length escalating to calling in a drone strike.
It's absolute madness. But John Heath, the co-author, breaks down the logistics of this accusation in our source text and finds a massive, glaring timeline discrepancy that reveals what was likely really happening.
What was the discrepancy?
Hallett stated on the listserv that she called the FBI hotline in October 1994. However, Heath points out that in October 1994, the Unabomber's infamous manifesto had not yet been published. No one in the general public knew what his specific views were.
Right.
Furthermore, in October 1994, Hanson and Heath hadn't even begun writing the book Who Killed Homer. That, Hallett claimed, triggered her suspicion.
So the timeline is completely impossible. Why would she make this up? Or, if she did call, why would she claim it was about a book that didn't exist yet?
The authors speculate that she made the claim on the listserv out of sheer visceral anger over the scathing book review Hanson had written about her work. They suggest it was an attempt to retroactively smear her academic critics by associating them with a violent domestic terrorist.
Wow.
It reads as a desperate tactic to discredit their intellectual arguments through extreme character assassination, because she couldn't defeat their arguments on logical grounds.
It perfectly proves the author's entire point. Academic debate has completely lost its mind. It has abandoned the Socratic pursuit of truth, logic, and evidence, and descended into petty madness.
If we synthesize this entire journey, the Unabomber anecdote serves as the ultimate tragic metaphor for the author's overarching thesis. The humanities were once the sacred arena for rigorous, intellectual debates about truth, history, and human nature. But according to the authors, they have devolved into vicious and frankly absurd personal vendettas among a highly subsidized insular elite.
When professors cannot defend their ideas with logic, they resort to calling the FBI on their critics.
Exactly.
Let's zoom out and summarize this blazing bonfire we've been walking through. The authors of our source text are issuing a dire warning. The humanities are suffocating. They argue that classical studies have been hijacked by a careerist elite who prioritize ideological posturing, esoteric and incomprehensible theory, and staggering personal narcissism over the profound, accessible, and universal truths found in the great books of Western civilization.
They warn that by abandoning the rigor of the classics in favor of a therapeutic, relativistic multiculturalism, the university is failing its core mission. It is depriving students of the very tools, critical thinking, objective logic, and an understanding of universal human rights that they desperately need to navigate, understand, and ultimately improve the real world.
So turn this back to your own life. Think about your own education, or the education your kids might be getting right now. Have you ever sat in a class, maybe paying thousands of dollars for the privilege, that felt less like a genuine exploration of great, timeless ideas, and more like a professor's personal therapy session?
Or perhaps an ideological re-education camp where you are told what to think rather than taught how to think.
If the authors are right, we have to ask ourselves, why is society continuing to fund this system?
We want to leave you with a final, provocative thought, inspired directly by the text. To capture the absurdity of the situation, the authors quote a description of ancient academics living in Alexandria, Egypt. A critic named Timon of Phlius described their elite research institute as a wicker coop where academics are maintained like high-priced birds, subsidized bookosauruses, endlessly quarreling in the birdcage of the muses.
Subsidized bookosauruses in the birdcage of the muses. That is an incredible, haunting phrase.
It is a devastating image, and it raises a chilling question for us today. If the American university system has indeed become a modern birdcage, totally isolated from the reality of everyday life, filled with elites endlessly quarreling over their egos and arcane theories, what happens to our society's collective memory?
What happens to the wisdom of the ages when the public finally decides to stop paying for the bird feed?
Scary thought.
Imagine that grand, ancient library we talked about at the beginning. The roof is caving in, the smoke is thick, and the caretakers are still inside, warming their hands over the burning pages of Homer and Shakespeare, arguing about their own reflections in the glass cases. If they won't put out the fire, who will?
Think about that.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.